No matter what your favorite competitive hobby is, there exists some form of event meant to test your skill. In Yu-Gi-Oh!, the Yu-Gi-Oh! Championship Series events create the partition that divides the good players from the great players. Topping a YCS requires a combination of focus, skill, knowledge, wit, and a little bit of luck to achieve. In this series of standalone think pieces, I'll be sharing my own journey with you, detailing my perspectives on various aspects of the game in an effort to expand my knowledge and document my own Yu-Gi-Oh! Journey in an effort to, well, top a YCS. By far the most controversial topic in any card game involving deck building is luck. With cards like Imperial Order being limited, combos like Called by the Grave plus Triple Tactics Talent, or Pot of Desires drawing into another copy of itself, it's no doubt that luck is something that will always affect the modern game. Several things can be attributed to causing this. The limited list is thought to be problematic by a lot of players, especially for non-engine cards. Most wouldn't argue that Rat Pier should be at 1, but for cards like Instant Fusion and Red Reboot, they become incredibly sacky as while you're not likely to draw them, you will draw them sometimes, and they can definitely swing the game in your favor just because you drew them. As well, we know that the game is simply designed to have deviations from the norm involving luck, otherwise known as variance. In games like poker, the phenomena of variance is seen when the expected result of probability deviates noticeably. If by probability you should generally be opening a card only 12% of the time, but you see it 3 times among 6 games, you are experiencing some form of variance. There will be tournaments where despite all the math and despite all the deck building, you will see poor hands more often than expected due to variance, and others where you see incredible hands more often than expected. However, I feel that it's incredibly important to not immediately resort to thinking your losses as being to variance. It's a common fallacy in statistics to have too small of a sample size for these kinds of things, and realistically, variance shouldn't be taken as a reason for losing until all other possibilities have been ruled out. But what can we do about variance and luck? How can we as players minimize its effect on the match we play and win despite it? Well, we first have to understand some basics about luck. For instance, the gambler's fallacy. The gambler's fallacy is when someone on a losing streak expects to win big eventually, almost like the casino follows some kind of karma system, where the worse you do, the more likely you are to do better. In truth, the cards in our decks exist in a real physical space, and, assuming that they aren't handled with malicious intent, are sufficiently randomized each time. This means that the math sort of resets every time you shuffle and start a new game. Your deck does not owe you good hands because you've drawn several poor hands consecutively. It's important to keep that in mind as I go on. The next important thing to keep in mind are payoffs and time. Some strategies will be incredibly unlikely to go off, or may just be rare to see played. A good example of this would be preparing your deck for the meta, only to lose round 1 to an extremely obscure rogue deck that your deck has trouble with. This is a case of someone's deck building reaching a payoff. Something that they deck builded for is paying off for them and they are being rewarded for it, even if theoretically it's a poor deck choice in the long run of the tournament. In extreme cases though, this would be playing a deck like Gren Maju in a meta full of decks that main deck Lancia and shotgun it in the standby phase, only to never have Lancia drawn against you. You end up winning the tournament, and on the outside it seems incredibly lucky, and well, it kinda is. But it's also a part of the deck building process to set up these payoffs. In that extreme case, we could talk about whether or not that player deserves to win that tournament, but that's not the purpose of this video. The point is, they were rewarded due to variance, and that will happen just as often as someone will get punished by variance. Let's be a little more specific. I'm not talking about a card like Snipe Hunter, which relies on literal random chance in order to destroy a card. Again, we have no influence over a random chance, but we have some influence on variance. Take Pot of Desires for example. Don't hide it, you've drawn Desires off of Desires before. However, this has caused some players to cut Pot of Desires to 2 in their decks, with the reasoning being that it makes it significantly less likely to draw Desires off itself. This is a form of trying to influence variance via deck building, but is it the correct thing to do? Well, it depends. So we're gonna have to assume a few things here to figure it out. First, let's assume that every single card in your deck, aside from Desires, is a card that you are okay with banishing and a card you want to draw off Desires. Best possible scenario. What's correct? 2 or 3 Desires in your deck. Let's look at the math. In total, if you play 2 Desires and open one of them, you have roughly a 5.7% chance to draw into the second copy of Desires. And if you play 3, you have a total of 10.7% chance to draw into another copy. This is taking into account that you can banish Desires off of itself. That's right. Playing 2 Desires is only saving you 5% of the time at most. The math behind all of this is fairly complicated, so you might just have to take my word for it, or pause the video on this diagram to see how I got these numbers. So is it worth cutting it down? Well, I feel that most people would say no, You're reducing your chance of seeing desires in your opening hand by around 11%, just to dodge the 5% of drawing it off itself. The payoff you're going for is simply less valuable than the payoff of playing it at 3 and opening it more often. Drawing 2 cards is incredibly powerful, and even if you do draw another copies of desires, it's still Upstart Goblin at worst. So in most cases, 3 desires makes the most sense mathematically. But sure, that's fine. That's pretty conventional. What about a card like Brilliant Fusion though? How many copies of Garnet should you play if Brilliant Fusion was at 3? Conventional wisdom would tell you 1, but is it really so bad to play 2? Let's cut to the chase for this one. You'd have a 12.5% chance of opening Garnet and turning off Brilliant Fusion if you only played 1 Garnet. If you play 2 Garnets, you have a 1% chance of opening both. That means your Brilliant Fusion is much more live, right? Well, while you reduce the chance of having Brilliant Fusion be dead, you also increase the chance of opening Garnet in general from 12.5% to 23.7%. With 1 Garnet, Brilliant Fusion will be dead a total of 4% of the time. With 2 Garnets, Brilliant Fusion will be dead 0.3% of the time. So basically, it'll be live all the time. In order to save that 4% chance, you're taking an 11% increase in the chance of opening Garnet. That does not seem worth it. Again, just another example of how good deck building can affect variance. We have control over these ratios, and while something might seem like a good idea at first glance, taking a closer look at the math quickly reveals that it isn't. These things can be incredibly unintuitive, but that's why we should always double check before assuming something makes sense. Using a hypergeometric distribution calculator can help us calculate all sorts of things related to luck and variance. We can calculate our chance of bricking by designating a minimum number of engine cards we need to draw, then seeing the chance we don't draw enough. We can calculate how often we'll draw too many bricks in our deck to play the game. We can even use it to see how often we'll open a perfect hand. But this doesn't stop variance, now does it? All it does is reduce the chance that variance goes too far from what we expect. So what then? Is there nothing we can do? Well, it's possible that what we've discussed here is actually enough. With the right mindset, that is. If you see the game in a way less focused on the individual matches, but as the grand scheme of a multi-round tournament, you'll start to see what I mean. Yes, variance will always happen, and sometimes the risks you take in deck building will backfire. However, we can choose our deck, build our deck, and play our deck in a way that expects some amount of variance. And if you choose a heavy combo deck playing several bricks, then you'll be more susceptible to variance the longer the tournament goes for. That coin has 2 sides, however. If you choose an incredibly consistent and safe deck, there's a good chance that the ceiling of your deck is much lower, and you might not lose to variance, but to not having a high enough ceiling to stop your opponent from OTKing you. Seeing the game as designed around multi-round tournaments completely changes a lot of the frustrations of variance. It will always be there and it will always happen, but you really do have much more control over it than you think, and half the battle is accepting that it exists and being ready for it. Sometimes you just have to accept that match that you lose just to variance, knowing how unlikely it is, knowing that it can be frustrating, but it's not like you have to go undefeated to win the tournament. Anyway, thank you for watching. If you have any thoughts on this topic, or feel that there's any other inputs you have on variance, please share in the comments below. As usual, I'll be responding to as many comments as I can. If you enjoyed this video, it'd be really appreciated to leave a like, or possibly subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.